Hello and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve podcast. Today we are welcoming back Mr. Aaron Airmet, who is of course a Lord of the Rings expert. Let that sink there for a second. Just let that hang in the air. A Lord of the Rings expert. So you know where this is going. This is the second part because we spoke for so long in the first part and it went so well that I was like, maybe a second. Hell, I don't know. Maybe even a trilogy. Who knows? Yeah. But do you know what? I thought we'd ease into this, make it a bit fun. So here's a fun question directly from Vilma. Shout out to Vilma. These next few will be from her. If you could hang out with one character from Lord of the Rings for a day, who would it be and why?
Ooh, this is a good question, and let me just address the slander in which expert. Oh my goodness, those are
Get me
those are
worried
very
then.
big. Those are big shoes to fill.
Slander? Do I need a
It's,
lawyer?
I'm very flattered that you'd call me a Lord of the Rings expert, but definitely a big fan. I've read a lot, podcasted about it a lot, and I think I have a unique view on it. So I say slander sarcastically, but I really am humbled by that moniker that you would give me.
Well,
So
before you answer that question, what I will
yeah,
interject there is that I said that, and then we proceeded to do 2 hours of show, and you are an expert, man. I
yeah.
know many Lord of the Rings fans over the years. I've never known someone to know such intrinsic details about the stories themselves, the wider meaning of it, J.R.R. Tolkien's life and philosophy. I mean, I don't know. Like, I know maybe that term gets thrown around, expert, but I think really it's anyone who's taken a great deal of time to like fully master and understand a
Mm.
subject and who continues to as well. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say I've wandered many roads of Middle Earth, and there are many roads to wander, and there are many roads that have been wandered many times by many others, and I have wandered those roads, but I try to also find the other roads that have been, the other ways through the wilds of Middle Earth that maybe others haven't looked through so much. And part of that is maybe leading to Vilma's question, which is one of my favorite characters in Lord of the Rings is Aragorn. Like, I just love his arc, his story of coming from the shadows. He's being hunted all his life, rising from the shadows, and he has this amazing job to do within the context of the story of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth. And it's very heroic. It's very sacrificial. And in some ways, the story is about him, and in some ways, the story is not about him. But he is just able to fulfill that role in so many different ways and really remold or redefine what it means to be a king of a people rather than just I rule over you and my will is law, whatever. But Aragorn breaks that whole mold and shows what true leadership is and what true love for those who follow you shows what that can be.
You know, just as you were talking though, I just had a great idea for a series. So one interesting thing about Lord of the Rings, I know obviously it's probably explored quite a lot in the books, but in the film, we're introduced to Aragorn as, I believe, Strider. Was that his name that he was using?
Mhm.
Sort of a moniker. As you said, he was existing in in the shadows, quite literally. In the first scene that we see him, he's in a hooded
Exactly.
figure at the back of the bar. And it's kind of said, if I remember correctly, that he was involved in shady dealings. Like he wasn't like a bad guy, but he was kind of like a assassin of sorts, or maybe sort of like dance with the devil a little bit. And obviously, like Lord of the Rings, I guess is like the story of him realizing his true calling as king and becoming the noble Aragorn that we know and love. But the idea I just had, which I don't know what you think about this, would be so. Side note: I've been rewatching, oh sorry, watching for the first time, Better Call Saul, the Breaking
Mm.
Bad prequel.
Mhm.
And one thing that's really interesting from a storytelling perspective is how they've put it together as far as the timeline is concerned. So Better Call Saul, for the most part, is a prequel series to Breaking Bad. So essentially, it sets up the sets you up to understand how he got to the point in Breaking Bad where he is, and also after. after the fact. And you get choice kind of flashbacks of even before Better Call Saul events. You get choice clips of the future, and it's all kind of interconnected to tell a bigger story overall. So bringing that back to Lord of the Rings, I think, especially if they want to, because we spoke in the last show about how they're thinking about doing something with the original actors and stuff from the original trilogy, and I've always been a bit iffy about that. Like if it's within the same timeline, it's like, yeah, you can de-age people and stuff, or you can
Mhm.
just use makeup, but it's never quite the same. I think a better idea might be to do a prequel series, call it Strider,
Mhm.
and have mostly how he became sort of that guy in the run up to Lord of the Rings, and then also throw stuff of him as king, older king, old, Aragorn as an older
Mhm.
king, and somehow relate that to his Strider days. What say you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The idea of a young Aragorn, that was one of the popular ideas when Amazon announced that they were doing a TV show, and I think they were listening to pitches from several different potential showrunners, and a young Aragorn series was one of the popular going theories before they chose the Second Age and the story that they did do with the Rings of Power. And so I think there's definitely precedent for that. They are doing. There is Warner Bros. Is currently creating a film that is a pre-trilogy film
Oh,
called the Hunt for Golem, and it'll be a story where it follows Gandalf and Aragorn as they're trying to find Golem, sort of in between the moment where Gandalf realizes that Bilbo's ring is the One Ring, and before Frodo leaves the Shire. There's this sort of race to find where is Golem, what does he know, and does Sauron know what Golem knows about the One Ring? And so you have this whole series there that could be playing out. I think Warner Bros. Is the one behind that current film going on right now. And there's a lot of question around, well, do we bring Viggo Mortensen back to play Aragorn there in that film? I mean, he's grown quite a bit in the last 20 years since Lord of the Rings was filmed, and there's also precedent in the film universe of Lord of the Rings, if you will. You've got the Hobbit movies, which you had an older, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but you have the older character who plays Bilbo from the Lord of the Rings. Very white hair, very wrinkly face. He's very older. But then you have this flashback in time to the younger Bilbo, played by Martin Freeman, and just wonderful casting there. So they didn't have to do like the de-aging CGI type stuff. They just cast a new character, and you know what? Or they cast a new actor, and we were all okay with it, and we all loved it. And the casting of the Hobbit movies is one of those things that consistently rates high with fans. There's people have a lot of complaints about the Hobbit movies, but casting normally is not one of those. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of story to Aragorn. There's a lot of, I mean, he's lived 87 years of life before he shows up at Bree and the Prancing Pony Inn. He's got a lot of life that he's lived there, a lot of adventuring that he has already done. Part of which is explored in the appendices to Return of the King, and you've got some great stories there. One story is that the kingdom of Gondor is having these navy battles, if you will, with they're called the crosshairs of is it Harad or Umbar? There's a port down to the south, and I can't remember my geology right off the top of my head, but Gondor is having these sort of navy type scuttles on the sea, and Aragorn goes sort of in disguise. He sort of appears out of nowhere. I'm this great commander of men. He uses a different name than Aragorn or Strider, like totally different name, and he leads the men of Gondor in these great battles. And by the time they kind of finish off that war, he wins the war, and all the men are like, "Hey, you need to go meet our steward Denethor. Like Denethor would love to meet you and bring you more into his service." And he's like, "No, no, no. Like this isn't my time." And he sort of disappears from Gondor for like 20, 30, 40 years before he returns back when it's time to do the War of the Ring and Frodo's on his mission, and it's time for him to now take up his role as the king of Gondor. So Aragorn, there's a lot of backstory there that could be explored in film adaptations, TV adaptations. Lots of fun stuff. Lots of material to pull from.
If I remember correctly as well, there's quite a significant gap between when Frodo gets the ring versus when he's taken on the quest.
Hmm.
And they
Hmm.
do give you an idea of the timeline somewhat in the Fellowship of the Ring. I think it's implied maybe it's a few years.
It's several years, yeah. So in the film, Peter Jackson films, they truncate this greatly. I think for pacing in the film, it makes a lot of sense. But in the book, it's actually 17 years
Wow.
before Bilbo leaves. He gives his ring to Frodo. Frodo and Gandalf have that conversation, and Gandalf, up to this point, I mean, Frodo's had the ring, or sorry, Bilbo's had the ring for decades, but Gandalf has never once thought, hey, maybe this ring that Bilbo found is the one ring. He never actually considered that until Bilbo's birthday party and his conversation that he had with Bilbo and the
Mm.
hard time that Bilbo had giving up the ring. And that's what kind of clued Gandalf in. So that's when Gandalf goes and he goes to Gondor to read the archives. He talks with Saruman a bit, and he does a lot of investigating for those 17 years before Frodo actually does leave the Shire. And he comes back and he checks up on Frodo and such and such. But in the book, you have chapter one, which is Bilbo's party, and he gives the ring to Frodo. And then chapter two sort of begins 17 years later, if you will. And Gandalf is having this conversation with Frodo, telling him that he's discovered that he has the One Ring.
I just want to talk about the ring wraiths for a second. So, if I remember correctly, they can only find the ring or know of its location if it's actively used or worn, right? Is that right?
So that would be an implication from the films.
Hmm.
And I think this is probably a little bit hard for our modern minds to try to comprehend because we live in a time where I have an iPhone, my wife has an iPhone, I
Right.
have
Yeah.
iPhone devices, and so it's like if I lose my AirPods, I can open up an app on my iPhone and I know exactly where my AirPods are, and my iPhone will like direct me to the exact steps I need to take to find my headphones, right? And I think when we think of tracking services like that with our modern brains, like we're like, oh yeah, you know where it is exactly, and you're directed exactly to where that needs to go. You just open up your GPS. I don't think that Tolkien necessarily had that in mind. There's a connection between the Nazgul and the One Ring, and the movies certainly imply that, like, okay, if he puts on the ring, then the servants of Sauron can feel its presence, can feel its power. Yes, that's true. It's not exactly like here's GPS coordinates to where the One Ring is, but it's more like a sense or a feeling. And even when Frodo or Bilbo is not using the ring, there's still some connection. And
Mm.
let me give you an interesting example that I was actually just writing my episode for my own podcast about this. In 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 the book, you have several of the Nazgul attack a house in the Shire where they think Frodo is, and as they leave, it describes them leaving like a gust of wind, like gale. There's horns blowing, and these horses are galloping. Well, several hundred miles away, Frodo is in Bree. He's just met Strider, and he has these
Yes.
dreams where he feels like the wind is spinning around the inn, and he can hear horns blowing and horses' hooves. Like so, he's hearing to some degree what the Nazgul are experiencing hundreds of miles away, and so there's this weird connection that they have. And I don't know if it would be wise for us to try to ask too many scientific questions about the nature of this connection, besides the fact to know that it's there. It has some connection to it. It has some limitations to it. But it's, I would not say that it's fully explainable the way that you and I would use like a GPS or a I lost my iPhone type of an app.
What I was thinking is just like, okay, it wouldn't make for a good story, but like, let's suppose that they just like buried it away and just never did anything with it. Because like,
Hmm.
and the way it's like shown in the film is that Frodo doesn't really care about this ring. He's a bit like nervous and scared at the prospect, but then he genuinely just forgets about it because obviously it's not spoken about. It's just a weird, ominous warning from Gandalf, and he goes about his life for 17 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I wonder, like, if they had just like left it there, could that have maybe solved things, or would it have been the sort of thing where, yeah, I know how stupid this makes you
Yeah.
sound, but
Well, I don't.
it's a bit like the classic. Oh, why didn't the what was it? what they called that. Why don't they fly them
Why
over?
did they fly the eagles into Mordor and
Yeah,
just drop it? Yeah,
same
exactly.
thing. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if this is necessarily a stupid question because I think it was addressed. Tolkien wrote. There's a whole chapter called the Council of Elrond where they're deciding what to do with the ring, and it's very truncated in the films and much more expanded in the book, and that is sort of one of the proposals put forward of, well, let's just bury it and keep it secret. And there's a few reasons put forward of why that's not necessarily a good idea. In one case, that's sort of just you're delaying the inevitable. Like eventually, Sauron will find it, right? Eventually, he'll use the find my One Ring app, and he'll be led to it to some degree. Um, Either that, or somebody who knows its location will eventually be corrupted and tempted enough that they will pull the ring out to try to use it for their own good, for their own purposes. At which point, the ring would be revealed to Sauron anyway. So the idea of why couldn't we just hide the ring away? I think it's worthy of consideration, but there's definitely some reasons of why that was not necessarily the best approach to take.
All right, I'm going to ask you the question because I brought it up. So here it comes, just to annoy you. Why didn't the heroes of our story just fly eagles straight into Mordor?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this question in a couple of different layers. And I don't know, Christian, if you really realized how deep this question actually really is.
Ooh.
And so if you are not super familiar with Lord of the Rings and you just kind of watch the film and the eagles kind of show up and you're like, why didn't they just take the eagles in the first place? Well, okay. It seems like a surface level question, but if you look at the story in and of itself, like you have 9 Nazgul who are searching for the ring. And like we said before, they have some connection. They are drawn to it, not exactly like a GPS, but they are drawn to it. And after Rivendell, they were given steeds with wings. So we see later on in the movies that the Nazgul are flying around, they're doing reconnaissance, they're doing all that kind of stuff. And so to suddenly see great eagles flying from this mountain to Mordor, that's like a major tip off. And Sauron would have seen that coming, his spies would have seen that coming. And then you have the Nazgul, who are very formidable enemies. Even Gandalf is somewhat hesitant to go up against them. So let's get all 9 of them together and wraiths on wings, I think, as Gollum calls them in the movies. Like, probably not a good plan when your enemy can see you coming and also has, fighter jets up in the sky that can take you down. So that's one reason. Another reason is if you look deeper into the lore, the Eagles are not necessarily they're not like Uber drivers for Middle Earth. It's not like you can just call up Uber Eagle and get find a moth, call Uber Eagle, you get a ride to wherever you want to go. Like the Eagles are only according to the lore and the cosmology that Tolkien set up, the Eagles only intervene if they want to and if the divine powers of Middle Earth sort of give them the green light, if you will. And the divine powers of Middle Earth by this time in the Third Age, they are rather hesitant to get directly involved in the events that happen in Middle Earth. And there's a lot of reasons for that, going back from the First and the Second Age and different things, different interventions that didn't work out quite the way that they thought they would. And so by this point, those divine powers, the Valar they're called, they don't want to necessarily have direct involvement. Now they still show up. They have some indirect and some influencing and some real poignant moments. But at this point, they're much more reserved, and they want the peoples of Middle Earth to. This sounds not crass. This doesn't sound quite noble, but they kind of want the people of Middle Earth to solve their own problems, if you will, or at least to have the growth and the experience that comes from the struggle against Sauron and that sort of challenge. When you're challenged that way, you have to grow and become, rather than just these divine powers being like, oh, we're going to step in and solve your problem every single time you have a problem, right? Anybody who's been a parent or a teacher or a leader of human beings recognizes this problem of you can't just step in and solve the problem all the time. You have to let people grow and experience it. And so that's one of the reasons why they didn't just fly the eagles. I'll give you one more. In the context of the story, Gandalf, in the Council of Elrond, when they're going over all of their different options of what they could do with the ring, it's very clearly decided that they have, number one, that they have no good option, but at least the least bad option is a stealth mission. right? Not We're not going to march with huge armies. This isn't going to be a mission of speed. It's not a mission of strength. It's a mission of stealth. And the easiest way to do stealth is with a couple of hobbits on the ground, maybe a couple of big protectors to help them out, and let's have them sneak into Mordor and destroy the ring that way.
To speak to that as well, in the context of the story, would that be considered the best option because it's like the one option that Sauron would probably not expect? You know, like, oh, why would they send the most defenseless, most, you know, clearly not fearsome characters possible? Like, you know, like they could have sent anyone. They could have sent orcs. They could have also not orcs, elves, dwarves, whatever. But instead, they just sent tiny hobbits.
Yeah, they sent the most innocuous, the most innocent, the most like if there's anything that Sauron is going to underestimate, it's going to be a halfling. Uh, and 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 so well, first off, the good peoples of Middle Earth have one advantage, which is they make a great bet, which turns out to be true, is that Sauron doesn't think that anybody would ever destroy the ring. So Sauron's going assumption is that if somebody found the ring, they would use it. They would use it, and I would know where the ring was, and I would know where I need to take out my enemies and reclaim my ring and get all my power back. And so that's what Sauron is prepared for. That's what he's doing. And so coming back to Aragorn, when Aragorn finally does reveal himself as, hey, I'm the heir of Elendil, and I'm gathering armies to come challenge you in your fortress land of Mordor, Sauron's thinking, great, I found out who has my ring. It is this heir of Elendil. He's gathering armies. He's coming against me. I got to take him out. I know where my ring is, right? And so that's one of the ways in which Aragorn is a distraction for Sauron. But halflings, Sauron did not even know that halflings existed before he found out that one of them had his ring from Gollum. And it's a going literary. There's this fun literary theme when you read The Hobbit. Every chapter of The Hobbit, Bilbo encounters a new character or a new species. He encounters dwarves, he encounters elves, he encounters trolls, he encounters orcs. And for Bilbo, these new creatures are all new to him. It's a new experience. But the inverse is also true. That for all of these characters, all of these creatures, these species, they've never encountered a hobbit before. That's why Smaug is like, hey, I've never smelled you before. I know what dwarf tastes and smells like, but I don't know what you taste and smell like. And so you carry that over into the macro, and you have Sauron, who does not know who hobbits are, these halflings are, completely underestimates them, because for him it's all about strength and power and the will to dominate. And the complete opposite of that are the hobbits in their little land of the Shire. And so to send a hobbit to Mordor is just completely outside of his realm of imagination.
To speak to the character of Sauron, let's explore that for a second. If I remember correctly, it's a bit of a like Voldemort situation where Sauron was the being was destroyed in a battle like several ages prior, and they show that at the beginning of Lord of the Rings in the creation of the ring and etc. But he's shown to be like this fearsome, all powerful being who is seemingly unstoppable, but he is still a mortal man and is destroyed in battle. But his power, if you like, doesn't die. The ring, the Eye of Sauron, of course, is his magical force kind of watching over, presiding over Middle Earth, and obviously it's tied with everything, the Nazgul and the ring itself. So let's suppose that like Sauron got the ring back. Is the plan to sort of reconstruct him, like bring him back to life? Is that the idea? Like, let's speak about Sauron for a minute.
Yeah, so Sauron is an interesting character, and in the lore and the cosmology that Tolkien set up, Sauron is actually not a mortal man. He is a divine being first and foremost. He is a spiritual being. He's of a class of spiritual beings that Tolkien called the Maiar, and these are sort of like, if you will, archangels who serve the more divine beings, the Valar that I was referencing earlier. And so Sauron is not necessarily mortal. And Tolkien talks a little bit about this in like the Silmarillion, where the Maiar and the Valar, these spiritual divine beings, they can put on mortal forms the same way that you and I put on a set of clothes. So it's like you put on a shirt. Well, you are not the shirt, and the shirt is not you, but that shirt is representative of you, and is sort of encasing the person of you. And so when Sauron puts on a mortal body, it's sort of that same idea of the mortal body is not Sauron, but it is encasing his spirit, his power, his consciousness, if you will. And at the end of the Second Age, Sauron, his mortal body is destroyed, and the only way that his power is not destroyed is because he had created this one ring in which he had poured so much of his spirit, his power, his life force, if you will, into this physical object. And that's one of the reasons why the ring is so powerful and evil, is because you have this divine evil person who has literally put his soul into a thing, right? And for those of you who have listened to Harry Potter, you're like, yeah, that's what Voldemort did, right? He created all these
Right.
Horcruxes. And so yeah, sure, Horcruxes. If you want to call the One Ring a Horcrux, yeah, we can
He's pissed
descend
off
to
some
that
people
level.
there. Oh, I know
Yeah,
where you stand on that debate.
yeah, exactly. But that One Ring is Sauron's, I guess, for lack of a better term, insurance policy to come back and have his presence in Middle Earth like continue to be felt. That his power will never be gone from Middle Earth until that One Ring has been destroyed. And so, is he mortal? No, he's not mortal. But could he be destroyed or banished or somehow have his power completely removed from Middle Earth? Yes, absolutely, and it all depends upon the One Ring and its destruction.
You mentioned it in the last show, and you've mentioned it a little bit here. I'd like to explore it. So you painted it as almost like being bigger and better and more complex than Lord of the Rings itself. Speak to us about the Silmarillion. What's it about?
Yeah, the Silmarillion. So, for anybody who's not heard what the Silmarillion is, it is a book that was published after Tolkien's death by his son Christopher.
Mm.
It covers tales that happen in the first and second ages of Middle Earth. If you don't know what that means, when you watch The Fellowship of the Ring or you read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, those tales take place in what Tolkien called the Third Age of Middle Earth, and in fact, even like 3,000 years into the Third Age. And so, what the Silmarillion does is it goes back to it. It opens up with the creation story of Middle Earth and how this whole world was created. It has a few tales before time was even began to be recorded, and then the story really starts to get going as the first elves awaken and have consciousness and language, and that's where you get the foundational tales of the first age of Middle Earth. The interesting thing about the Silmarillion is Tolkien had these stories in his mind decades before he ever wrote The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. In the trenches of World War I, a young Tolkien got trench fever. He gets sent home. He's on sick leave back in England, and he starts to write down some of the stories that have been percolating in his head for years, even at that point. 1917, he writes what we know today as The Fall of Gondolin. And that is one of the three great tales that creates the bones of the Silmarillion. After The Hobbit was published, people wanted more. They wanted more Middle Earth. They wanted more. And Tolkien was very keen to publish the Silmarillion right after that, but he gave the manuscript to the publishers and they were like, yeah, this is probably too much, and we need some hobbits, because hobbits don't appear at all in the Silmarillion. They're just not there. And so that led him to be like, okay, well, I'll go and write a quote unquote sequel to The Hobbit that led to The Lord of the Rings, etc.
Wow.
And Tolkien even hoped to have like the Silmarillion published at the same time of Lord of the Rings, and he just kept tinkering with it and kept writing it. And so parts of the Silmarillion are really well dialed in. Parts of it, his son Christopher had to sort of fill in the holes or take different manuscripts and compile them or choose one over the other. And that was published a few years after Tolkien's death. So the Silmarillion, complex. It's a complex book. It's tough to read. The language is different. It's not exactly like a novel like what we would expect from Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. I have heard it described as sort of a collection of short stories that kind of have a narrative overhead to it. And it can be daunting to read for first-time readers. And it actually was the Silmarillion. That was the inspiration behind starting Lord of the Rings, my podcast, which is let me help you as you try to read the Silmarillion for the first time, let me help you because I've read it. I don't even know how many times by now. Like it's amazing. Um, but let me help guide you as you read through this Silmarillion for the first time. And that was like the first 40 to 50 episodes of the Lord of the Rings podcast.
Let's explore your podcast a bit more because you got to like plug it for about all of 30 seconds last time. And you mentioned it here, and I feel like it'd just be mean to hold off on it at this point. So tell me, first of all, I just want to say it's a great name for a Lord of the Rings podcast. Lore of the Rings. Are you kidding
Mm-hmm.
me?
Mm-hmm.
Let's
Yeah.
explore, man. Other than what you just laid out, like what can people expect from your show?
Well, thank you on that name. That was actually not the original name. The original name was A Beginner's Guide to Lord of the Rings, which was a really long name for a podcast. But I tried to really imbibe that idea of if you are a first time reader of Tolkien or a first time in a long time, or you've only seen the films and you haven't read any of the actual stories that Tolkien wrote, then you are missing out on a richness of stories, of wonderful philosophy, amazing world building, amazing characters. And so I wanted to try to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit and say, you might love Lord of the Rings, but there's a deeper world here that will just make you fall in love with it at another deeper, richer level. And that's what I wanted to do when I started Lord of the Rings. Was many people they 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 knew I was a big Lord of the Rings fan, an expert, as I have been called sometimes by some people, and they'd ask me questions. They're like, "Okay, so what's this thing? Why don't elves and dwarves like each other? Why don't they fly the eagles to Mordor?" And people would ask me these questions, and I would have these responses, and I was like, "Okay, I think just need to start talking about this in a more structured way," and that was the impetus behind the Lore of the Rings podcast, and it's just been a fun adventure ever since the last 2 or 3 years.
So when you say it started out with just questions, like a typical episode of your show, would it just be like, okay, this person posed this question, let's explore that, and then you build a show off the back of that? Or is it more like you just pick out certain topics and explore them? Like, talk to us about that.
Yeah, so it was not so much of people would ask me questions. That was sort of what my tipping point of realizing, hey, I had something to offer here is because people would come, people that I knew, friends, neighbors, people I worked with, etc., and they'd come ask me questions. But what I really started with was, here's the Silmarillion. It has 15 chapters, let's say, um, and I'll just take one chapter per episode and just try to break it down and be like, here are the characters that you're seeing, here are the themes that you're going to see. Make sure that you pay attention to this detail because it's going to come up later. Here's some of the other details that you probably don't need to worry about right now. Okay, that's one episode in 15 minutes. Okay, let's do the next episode. Or let's do the next chapter. Let's do the next chapter. Let's do the next chapter. And so it really was, the idea behind it was, go read a chapter of the Silmarillion, get that taste of Tolkien's writing for yourself, and then come and have a little bit of a guide with you. Go find a little bit of an Aragorn or a Strider who has wandered these paths before, who can give you a little bit of guidance on your journey through the Silmarillion.
So I don't normally ask these questions to a fellow podcaster because I mean it's just kind of like not that interesting. But in this case, yeah, I'm fascinated. How long is an average episode of your show? Because I feel like it's definitely not 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, when I do guest interviews, they're typically longer, but my weekly episodes, I do try to keep them to about 15-20 minutes.
Oh
And
wow.
that was a deliberate decision on my part from the very beginning,
Okay.
because I love, like, you and I are sitting here talking about Lord of the Rings, I think for our third or fourth hour now, right? Like, I love that sort of in-depth conversation.
Hell yeah.
Let's analyze this. Like, I have a couple of different Lord of the Rings podcasts that I listen to that I just love how they do that. But I was very deliberate in trying to find the beginner. As I said, my first title of the podcast was A Beginner's Guide.
Hmm.
And I was really very deliberate about, okay, you've seen the films and you're reading for the first time, or maybe reading the Silmarillion, you've never even heard of the Silmarillion before. Let me guide you on these next few steps. And I made an assumption that has since proven to be true from a lot of feedback from listeners, which was people don't want to listen to a 1 hour breakdown of a chapter from a book that they've never even heard of from Tolkien, right? And so I was very deliberate about keeping it to 15-20 minutes. And that's to say, like, I'll reach a time limit I'll do just like what we're doing today, which is okay. Let's break this down. We'll do a part two. There's one story in the Silmarillion that it's called Beren and Luthien, and I think I did 4 or 5 parts on just that one chapter because it is such a key pivotal chapter to understanding the lore of Aragorn and Arwen and where all of these things come from in the Third Age of Middle Earth. So I really kind of slowed down that one, but yeah, 15-20 minutes. That's the goal for
I'm
my solo
impressed.
episodes.
I remember when I first started my show, like I couldn't figure out what the sort of golden rule is as far as like how long should this be? How long do I want to talk? How
Mm,
long can I talk, etc.
mhm, mhm.
And I started like, like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, didn't feel like a lot. Then it was like too long. Like I remember doing 2 or 3 hour shows, and I still don't have like a set optimal time. I don't.
Yeah,
The way I
yeah,
do it is if it's a conversation with someone, or even if it's just my own episodes, it goes as long as it needs to go.
yeah,
And I think one of the benefits of having quite a lot of shows as well under your belt after a while is that people can kind of pick and choose. So if they're like, I don't really want to go on that journey, I want a quicker one, then there'll be quicker
mhm,
ones, you know?
mhm, mhm.
I think it depends. Like I knew that these shows would be long. I just knew it. And but I think it's that kind of topic where this is what I mean. Like I find it amazing that you're able to break it down in that way. That must take a lot of planning and organization because there's so much to explore.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
still, like I've only asked you like maybe like 3 or 4 questions, but it's like nearly 45 minutes. It's like what?
yeah,
But that's the reality of the subject, really, isn't it? If you really get into it and you really take a stab at answering the
yeah,
questions, and that's how the conversation is going to go.
yeah. I'm definitely partial to now that I've been into the show for about 3 years now to be like, let's make the episode as long as it needs
Mm.
to be interesting. And but I've kind of found that I have a good sweet spot with my rhythm of 15-20 minutes. I think it works well for my listeners. And yeah, like I just released episode 200 as of
Woo!
this recording like last week.
There you go.
Um,
Congrats.
can you think 200 episodes of just exploring Tolkien, like the Lord of
Just
the Rings,
talking.
right? Just Tolkien. That includes like guest episodes and solo episodes and chapter breakdowns and movie breakdowns, reactions to Amazon's Rings of Power, like that. And like you just said, I finished episode 200 by saying, "Look, guys, look, listeners, we're only scratching the surface. Like 200 episodes in, like there is still so much more to explore. So I hope you're ready. Get your adventure boots on because we're gonna go 200 more episodes, and then 200, and then 200 more. And I just don't know when this is ever gonna end because there's just Middle Earth is just there's just so many layers. You peel something back, and there's something new, and there's something new, and there's something new, and it's amazing.
Dude, I know exactly what you mean. It's funny, like when I talk to people about my podcast sometimes, like people I've never met, and they're obviously the standard questions: how long has it been going? How many episodes? And people's faces drop when I tell them 5 years, nearly 300 episodes,
Mm.
and it's like, how? What? Why? What? And it's like
How
if
can you
you
talk that long? Yeah.
well, that's the thing. Like, it's funny as well because I've gone through like waves of being like I've always enjoyed doing the show, but there's been times where it felt more kind of methodical. Like, okay, I'm just doing this, I'm getting it out, and I always loved it. Like, I always loved the conversation. To be
Mhm.
clear, I would never phoned it in or didn't make an effort when it came to show day. It was just all the other shit, the editing, the
Right.
promoting, the
Right.
just and like especially sometimes. I know my audience will knock my head for saying this, but it's true. Like you put all this time and effort into a show, and when it doesn't land like a bunch of views or listens or whatever, it can hit you. It can really get you
Mhm.
down.
Mhm.
But then there's the other side of looking at it, which been seeing this a lot lately online, and I think it's really good to bring up here. Consider like how many people are listening, and then imagine those people in a room watching you or listening.
Yeah.
So if it's
Mhm.
10 people, that's 10 people sitting and listening. Imagine that. You're on stage, you've got
Yeah.
10 people listening to you. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
But even one person, do you know what I mean? Better than none. And believe me, I
Yeah.
played gigs where there was no one in the room. So trust me, even one is you're over the moon. That's a success.
Yeah. It is. It is. It is honor. I am honored and I am humbled by people who tune in to something that they love Lord of the Rings, and then they tune in to hear my thoughts about it, and that is rather humbling. And I heard a podcaster say today, and he creates content for podcasters about how to podcast. And
Cool.
he said, don't discount yourself. If you have 29 people who are tuning into your podcast every day, like that's a full classroom of people
Yep.
every week who are
Hmm.
tuning in to hear your thoughts. Like, don't discount that. Like that's something amazing. And so if you're a burgeoning, blossoming podcaster out there who's got 1, 5, 10 downloads a week, keep going. Just keep going.
I'm getting more and more excited about it, to be honest. Like as I approach 300, I said this to you off camera. I'll say it here for our viewers, for our listeners, that I'm planning to do a lot more. I've just got rid of all the clips, which was a big decision. It took when I first started this show, I didn't do clips. I think for the first year, and then it became apparent that I should start doing it. So I did. I tried it. I did it for about 4.5 years. And then it never really helped the show particularly. Like it did a few times here and there, but mostly they're like two things that exist outside of each other. There's because I've heard that a lot over the years that there's people that they won't listen to a whole podcast, but they will check out clips,
Hmm.
and that's cool, you know. But I first and foremost always wanted to do a podcast,
Yeah.
a full show, and now I got a sense of relief when I deleted those channels. I'm not gonna lie, or I just I don't know if I deleted them, if I just like that thing where you can like deactivate it.
Hmm.
I just felt relief, and
Yeah.
but I got excited in that moment because I was like, nah, I can do more shows, and we can build up those numbers, and I can get back to what I do best, and that's just talking to people and telling stories and all that great stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, exciting, man. 5 years in, let's keep going.
That's exciting.
Let's keep these questions going as well. Let's get back to Lord of the Rings. So, thank you, Vilma, for these. What do you think makes Frodo the right choice to carry the One Ring? Despite, I love how she's put this, despite not being the strongest or most powerful character, she says, I never really understood that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Why Frodo? Well, I think first off, he's a hobbit, and for all the reasons that we explored before, hobbits are underestimated. They're very stealthy on their feet. They're very resilient. Resilient is a key. So hobbits do not have a natural inclination to power or to uh, contests of will or dominance. Their natural inclination is just so opposite to that. And it was well said by Thorin in The Hobbit before he died. And I'm going to paraphrase this, but he says to Bilbo, "If more of us valued cheer and peace and comfort over hoarded wealth, then this would be a merrier world." I butchered that, but that's kind
Mm.
of Thorin's idea, and that is what hobbits are, right? They're just content. They're grateful. They're maybe a little bit stupid in their ways, right? A little bit backwards, but they are resilient, and so Frodo makes the perfect choice there. So why Frodo versus some of the other hobbits, like Sam, for example, or Merry or
Mm.
Pippin? Well, number one, Frodo was actually older than the other hobbits in the books. He's got a couple of decades on them, so he's 50 years old, and the other hobbits are just out of their irresponsible tweens, which for humans would be about 20 years old, but for hobbits, they're still kind of in that teenage type phase, right? Merry, Pippin, and Sam. So he's a little bit older and more mature. And there's also another thing about Frodo that I'm just picking up in my latest read of Fellowship of the Ring as I've been going kind of doing these chapter by chapter analysis. Frodo is able to adapt to the circumstances that he is in. And this is particularly manifest in the way he talks with people. So when he talks with, there's a scene where Frodo meets some elves in the Shire when he and Sam have just left Bag End. He come across some elves, and Frodo speaks to them in this very high language. He even uses elvish phrases with them, and he's able to really speak to them in that context. Now you move forward, and Frodo is at Bree, and again he's able to change his language and adapt to that circumstance. So Frodo shows this real knack of wisdom and adaptation, of knowing where he is and what context he is operating in, and how he needs to adapt to that situation in order to collaborate and work with and move through that situation wherever he is. And I think that Sam doesn't do this. Sam is not as cultured and refined as Frodo is, so Sam is not able to do that. Merry and Pippin, uh, Merry is more wise in the book than he is in the films, but still not quite to what Frodo's level is. So I think that makes Frodo the great choice for this. One last thing about why a hobbit. So when Sam, what the what one of the, what when people are tempted by the One Ring, it shows them their deepest desires, like if they were taken to the fullest, right? So Galadriel is tempted to have the ring because she's like, "Oh my goodness, you could have this beautiful queen that everybody would love me." Like that's Galadriel's like deepest desire times 10, like to infinity, right? When Sam in the book, when Sam is carrying the One Ring for Frodo after he's been stabbed by Shelob, right? Sorry, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read the books or seen the films. But there's a moment where there's just a few minutes where Sam is carrying the ring, and the ring shows him you could make the whole world a garden with trees and flowers blooming everywhere. And it's like Sam is just he's just a humble, simple gardener, and the ring taps into that deepest desire and multiplies it to the fullest. And I think that just goes to show why should a hobbit carry the ring? Because what's the worst thing that's going to happen if a hobbit claims the ring? He's going to turn the world into a garden, right? And so that resilience, that just that denial of power and dominion, is what makes a hobbit the perfect choice to carry the ring.
If you had to explain the appeal of Lord of the Rings to someone who had never read the books, seen the films, or maybe even heard about anything to do with Lord of the Rings, what would you say to them?
That's a fantastic question, and I actually have had the opportunity to do this, and in some cases it depends on where that person is coming from. I was having a conversation at a conference, at a work conference, a few months back with someone, and this was an individual who doesn't watch movies at all, doesn't engage with
Wow.
TV, doesn't engage with stories at all.
What did
And I
they
was like,
do? What did
I
these
was like,
people do?
yeah, exactly. I was like, do you like to read? And he's like, yeah. And he's like,
Okay.
you probably read nonfiction and business books, right? And he's like, yeah, usually those types of books. And I was like, okay, well, that's fine. Um, and that's one way to gain knowledge and experience is by reading those types of books. And I think they view stories as sort of frivolous, just like candy for the brain and like not helpful at all in gaining experience. And so with this particular individual, I kind of tried to talk with him and be like, well, there's value in reading nonfiction for sure. Like that's great. But there's also another value of gaining wisdom and experience by literally putting yourself in the shoes of another person and experiencing the life that they have and the choices that they make, and you can live through that other person and find value and experience in that. And for me, Lord of the Rings is has so many different opportunities to do this. Let's look through the eyes of a hobbit or a dwarf or an elf or a mortal man or an elf queen and or evil Sauron for that matter, and let's take upon us these different roles and try them out. And do I like being this character? Do I not like being this character? Why or why not? If I wanted to be more like a hobbit, how might I change and live my life? If I wanted to be more like an evil person like Sauron, how might I live my life? Or if I wanted to avoid that, what things might I change in my own life? And so I try to appeal to them in that sense of the value that stories can bring in revealing truth of the human experience. And Lord of the Rings for me is just in a league of its own in helping humans understand the human experience through story in a way that no other story or universe has been able to do for me, at least.
Yeah, and just to speak to what you were saying there, like I think it's so important in life to to educate yourself with stories, with characters, whatever, I remember like some of my best lessons I had when I was at school, university, were the ones where stories were told or when comparisons, metaphors were made and things were broken down in that manner. Because that really speaks to humans on a deeper level.
Hmm.
It's the reason why I love doing this show. And yes, I'm sorry, I sound like a broken record, but storytelling, I mean, I've had people on the show to talk about this before. Storytelling is an art form and
Yes.
it does everything. It can make you laugh, it can make you cry, hopefully it makes you think, but certainly it can do that. It can make you sort of force yourself to consider things from a different perspective.
Hmm.
Obviously, it can be useful as a form of comparison. How would I deal in this situation? Would I do the same thing? Would I look at it differently? These are important questions I think a human being should ask themselves. And if you're not asking yourself these sorts of questions, if you're just working on impulse, it's problematic. If you'll afford me a minute to talk about this for a second, the younger generation, God, that sounds so old. The young generation. I'm 31 and I've been noticing a big problem. I suppose it's mostly on the internet. What I will say is this: when I meet people that are younger, that are driven and have a particular goal, like I want to be a musician, or I want to be a dancer, or I want to be an accountant, or whatever, like that's great. That's classic. That's what human beings need. You need goals. You need something to build. It keeps the mind occupied. You grow. You meet people. You have experiences. All these things shape you, your life, and everything in between. Now, if you don't have those things, if you're part of this online age group, or it's not just younger people as well, I see older people that are part of it too. If you're part of this kind of mindset of I want to purely go on impulse, I want lots of followers, lots of attention, I want
Hmm.
to instant gratification. I mean, they call a lot of what we see online brain rot. It's actually a type of thing, and it has an impact on you. It's the
Hmm.
reason why I love podcasts, because here's the reality with a podcast: it might very well be something that you put on in the background and you half listen to, or maybe you just like the sound of that person's voice, or maybe it's just something useful while you're working. I don't know. There's lots of reasons to listen to a podcast, but if you actually sit and listen, or have it to the side while you're doing something and you're absorbing all of it, it can really be quite impactful. It can teach you a lot. It can provide you with these life lessons and help shape your mind. And I do worry sometimes with the younger generations. I think that, bringing it back to our topic, if they were to delve into these stories like Lord of the Rings more so, they would discover not only a fantastic story, but a wealth of information, a wealth of life lessons.
Hmm.
Big reason why I do this show is so that I can share life lessons from people from all around the world, people from all different backgrounds, industries, demographics, age ranges, you name it. Like everyone's got something to share. I remember someone said this to me years ago. They said, everyone knows something that you don't.
Hmm.
One thing. And if you really sit and think about it, there'll be one thing that you know that no one else knows, or that you've experienced that no one else has experienced, or that maybe you're good at that not many people are good at, or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm.
And another one I'll add to this is when people are looking for a reason to do something. For example, if you're a podcaster and you're listening to this and you're thinking, there's just so many podcasts out there. Should I even bother? Why should I do it if everyone else has done it? Well, consider this. If you do decide to do it, it'll be the first time that you've done it. And that's going to be a profound feeling for you. And who knows what you'll discover. Like, I became a better conversationist because of being a podcaster. I learned active listening skills. I learned how to pace a show and structure and organize better. And it really has helped me in all areas of my life. And I'm very thankful for it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I
what
love that you
does,
say that, and I think it comes back to the storytelling, right? If yeah, people have done podcasts before, but what's your story? What's your voice in this realm? And in particular, the idea of life lessons through story. Like that's one of the reasons why I continue to go back to Lord of the Rings for decades. Is I just find the philosophy, the worldview, the wisdom that is just in the atmosphere of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth. I can't get enough of it. So I go back and I try to find more wisdom, more truth, more insights into the human experience, and that's one of the reasons why I love Lord of the Rings, and one of the reasons why I would try to appeal to somebody who hasn't experienced it at all. Which is, if you are a seeker of truth or wisdom, or just simply good things, then you will have an endless trove to wander through in Middle Earth.
what do you love most about Lord of the Rings?
You know, I have struggled to answer this question. And after 200 episodes of podcasting about Lord of the Rings, you'd think I'd find an answer to this. And I think one of the reasons I struggled to do this is I don't know if you've seen the movie Fall Guy with Ryan
Yeah,
Gosling and Emily Blunt.
great
There's
film.
Ryan Gosling's character has this amazing line where he's like, you know, when you know you have something important to say and you don't want to mess it up, so you think a long time about it, and then you realize you've already messed it up because you've thought too long about it. Like that's kind of how I feel about answering this question of why do I love Lord of the Rings so much? Because it's like it's so important to say something so wise here. I don't know
Mm,
if I've been able to really articulate that, and I think in some way we've you know, maybe I've already said it to a certain degree before, which is the wisdom that Tolkien brought to the Lord of the Rings, to the stories, to the things that are there. Like if I could, I try to seek after those things which make me more wise, which make me a smarter, better man, build my character, help me to live a more satisfying and fulfilling life. And when I look at the Lord of the Rings and all of Tolkien's writings, I even read the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which we have copies of his letters, and I'm like, just that insight into his brain and worldview and psychology, like even just that is just so inspiring to me. And it's that inspiration, that wisdom that I continue to find in Lord of the Rings that, you know, I could go watch a Marvel movie and it'd be fun and entertaining and, you know, good guys versus bad guys. And there'd be some moral truths there. And that's awesome. But that's sort of like, you know, eating candy when I could be going over and having in the US, right, the United States, Thanksgiving dinner of a deep, rich meal that is sustaining and special and amazing. And every single bite is something totally new, even though you thought you had turkey before. But this meal is just something deeper and richer than ever before. That's what the Lord of the Rings is to me.
okay, that was beautiful. Now I'm about to ruin it. I'll be impressed if you can. Let me rephrase that. I will be intrigued if you can answer this.
Hmm.
Not because you're not capable, not because I don't think you have anything to say, but more because this is something you absolutely love. So, my question to you is, what do you dislike about Lord of the Rings?
Yeah. Well, we mentioned some of this earlier before, which
Gonna
is
shit on the Hobbit again.
yeah. Well, we could do yeah, we definitely do that on the Hobbit movies for sure. But Tolkien had this ability. Tolkien's writing style was he would essentially write by the seat of his pants. He said at some point that he'd have kind of like some high level plans, some outlines, but when he really got into it, he was like he was just kind of writing it at the seat of his pants, and so like flying by the seat of your pants, so to speak. So what happens is you get a couple of little plot holes and things that happen. Like for example, why does it take 17 years for Frodo to leave the Shire? Like, does that not maybe indicate that hey, this one ring, maybe it's not that important if it takes 17 years in the narrative. Now, granted, in the actual chapter itself, it's only like a couple of paragraphs, but when you think about it, it's like, wow, that seems weird. Um, Plus, when you look at some of their descriptions of their journeys, like Tolkien, and a lot of people have criticized Tolkien for this, but it's like it's just people walking, and he describes every hill and every tree and every type of bush and all these little things, and I'm like, and part of me wants to defend that, and I say, well, yeah, that's just really good world building and storytelling and inner consistency of reality, and it's those details that make it rich. But I'll admit, Christian, between you and me and everybody else who's listening to this, I've had times where I've read Lord of the Rings and I skip the description of the trees and the hills and all those details. I know you're flabbergasted. We're speechless. I know, but it's like sometimes I think Tolkien could get a little bit too far into his own world and forget that he's trying to tell a story.
No,
That
I get it,
yeah.
man.
Let me say one more. Let me say
Yeah,
one
please,
more.
please,
That's
please.
all right. Tolkien used a literary device of characters telling stories within the story, and he uses that a lot. And there are some chapters which are basically like three characters had other experiences, and they're coming back and they're like around the campfire sharing what happened to them, and they're recounting the story. Like that happens quite a bit, and it's a common literary device of his time. But I think he maybe overused that a little bit, and we probably could have used a little bit more of like, let me experience this thing with you rather than knowing that you survived it and now you're here to tell the story of, like Gimli telling the story of the paths of the dead. Like you get half of that story with Gimli, but the other half is like him sort of telling it after and he's reflecting on that experience. Like the movies do it where you're going right through the characters in time, but in the book you get a lot of, oh, we experienced this horrible thing, but you obviously know it turned out well because I'm here to tell you the story. I think you can overuse that literary device just a little bit. So there you go. I don't know if you expected me to two or three things where I criticize Tolkien on, but there you go.
No, I appreciate it, man. Thank you. Because I think it is difficult to criticize something you love, and it's. I suppose like sometimes people could argue like, oh, you're just looking at it through the eyes of love, so of course you're not going to criticize it. But there's always something. There's always something that you can find, and the things that you've listed, like, I would argue that a lot of authors are guilty of this. Some people would argue it's embellishing. Some people would be like, "Oh, it's just not necessary." It could even be just argued as a writing style. But I think for some people, it's just you want to get straight to the story. You want to get to like what's happening, where are we going. If there's like a good example of this in movie form would be Star Wars, the prequels. Like, I remember someone describing it as like it's just fucking talking. It's just endless
Yep.
talking.
Mm-hmm.
People sat in circles talking,
Mm-hmm.
and like
Yep.
that conversation can be great if it's intense, if it's structured well. But there has to be a point to it. There has to be like a setup to it. Like a good example of this would be probably Reservoir Dogs the movie, because that all takes place pretty much in one room
Mm.
with a few guys, right? But the way the interactions move, it kind of builds the story and still keeps you interested. And there's action, and it's not all just talking. There's like fights. There's
Mm-hmm.
accusations. There's like who's the snitch. Like there's all these different elements to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. Maybe less is more sometimes. But I don't know. It's opinion at the end of the day. Like what can you say? It's no. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I'm intrigued to ask you about this. Back in the 2000s, around the time of the games, oh sorry, read it. Around the time of the films, there were these amazing Lord of the Rings video games. I'm talking about specifically the PlayStation 2 ones. I think you know the one I'm on about. There was one, I believe it was released around the time of the second one, possibly the third one. I don't recall. But it basically was the entire trilogy in one game, if I remember correctly. And it was
Mm-hmm.
just you go around, you pick which character you want to be, and you could be any of them, like Legolas, Gimli, Gandalf, Frodo, if you want. It just sucked to be
Mm-hmm.
Frodo.
Mm-hmm.
But you could be all these different characters, and it was just like the best thing ever. And like the gameplay wasn't like anything amazing, like as it was just a standard like beat 'em up style. But it was great. It's perfect. It's exactly what you want. So I've got a few questions related to that. First question: did you play that game? What did you think about that? That must have been amazing for you.
Yeah. Well, maybe these questions will be really short because you have entered into a realm that is almost wholly unexplored by me, which are the game
Wow.
adaptations of Lord of the Rings. There's really only one actual video game that I played, and I can't even remember what it is, but it is basically you have your heroes and you build up your army, and the final scene of the game is like the battle outside the Black Gates of Mordor, and you can do be Gandalf and Aragorn and all these different things. I think I played it on the Nintendo Wii because I was a Nintendo guy,
Hmm.
and I don't think Nintendo had a whole lot of Lord of the Rings games, and I was so deep into like the Legend of Zelda, and like that's kind of like when it comes to video games, like Legend of Zelda. That's like I go deep. I go deep into that one. And so when it comes to Lord of the Rings video games, I am rather ignorant in that world.
It's cool. I mean, I'm not like an expert on it either, but like from what I remember, there was a ton of games then, and like there just hasn't been since. And I'm like perplexed by that. I mean, like there's
Yeah.
so much you could do. There's so many stories you could tell.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like oh my god, like imagine an open world Mordor game. Fuck me,
Yeah.
that'd be
Yeah.
insane.
It'd be really awesome. It'd be
To
really fantastic. And I think there's more starting to come out. I remember a few years ago there was a game called Hunt for Golem, and you essentially played
oh
as Golem, but the game was so terrible that the company
yeah.
ended up like going bankrupt, I believe. I didn't play it, but I just heard so many people in the Tolkien community just ripping on it that it was just such a terrible, horrible game. There's another one coming out. I think it's called Tales of the Shire. And I think it's one of these sort of like, let me build up my farm and resources type games, but set like you're a hobbit in the Shire type thing. So,
That's sweet.
maybe there's a handful that are coming. But yeah, that's and I think Lord of the Rings has been somewhat unique, and like there have not been a lot of game adaptations to that. Let me theorize on this just a little bit. I think part of that is because the Lord of the Rings fan base. I'm gonna paint with really broad strokes here, but the Lord of the Rings fan base, in my opinion, tends to be more cerebral than experiential. What do I mean by that? Tolkien was a scholar, academic, brilliant person who wrote these stories. And for so long, the roots of the fan base have been let's read thick books about Lord of the Rings, right? Movie adaptations, game adaptations, those are relatively new to the world of Lord of the Rings. So the fan base of Lord of the Rings is much more, I don't want to say highbrow or ivory tower or something like that, but I just don't think they lend themselves to game adaptations as much as say a Star Wars or a Star Trek or some of these other universes. Now that's not to say that there haven't been games that have been successful and the fan base absolutely loves because that's clearly the case. But I think it's a little bit unique for Lord of the Rings, where it's more literary than it is um, video game adaptation.
Oh, thank you, man, for that. I
Just a
appreciate
theory,
that.
though.
No, I think you're probably right. I mean, I gave the example of an open world game, but to be fair, if you were going to do something like that, it'd be tricky to tie it. I don't feel like you could do an open world in the strictest sense. Like you could have elements to it, but like it'd still have to be within the context of the story.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's not Lord of the Rings. It's like adjacent to it kind of thing.
Yeah,
Like you couldn't do it a la Skyrim style, but you could. I mean, you could do a modern Lord of the Rings trilogy style game, and it would be exceptional. It would obviously be a huge undertaking to pull it off,
yeah.
but you could do
I,
it.
I think it's possible. Like I played Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom. I love those games. I absolutely love them. Played them several times and played them all the way through. And I think you just take that same engine, that same concept, and instead of Hyrule, it's Middle Earth. Instead of Link, you're Aragorn or Gimli, or
Hmm.
pick your character. And I think it could work.
We're willing for you to try.
Yes, yes. I
Please
will buy
try.
it. I will buy it.
Okay. Who is Lord of the Rings for? And who is it not for?
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. This is a thinker. My initial reaction is Lord of the Rings is for everyone because I think it is.
Hmm.
I think it is. I think there's enough depth and breadth in the story that everyone could find something to resonate with them in Lord of the Rings. And we talked in the first half of our conversation about representation and different things like that. Like if that's your only viewpoint of I have to have a story that represents this one quality in me, then maybe you could find that Lord of the Rings isn't quite for you. But I would say it this way: if you are a person who loves really good storytelling, if you are a person who loves journeys into the imaginal world, if you love imagination and creativity and exploring places that you have never been before through the written word, then the Lord of the Rings is for you. If you are a seeker of wisdom and truth and trying to elevate your own human experience, then the Lord of the Rings is for you. If you cannot think abstractly or creatively and you're a very literal person, Lord of the Rings probably is not for you. But I still think that you would find some things to resonate with you in there. Like this person I was describing earlier who doesn't watch any TV, watches no movies, reads no fiction. I'm like, well, you're kind of closing yourself off from the experience of that story. Um, and maybe that's okay. Yeah, for you. But I, I would say Lord of the Rings, I think, is for everyone. I think anyone could find something in there that works for them. And let me just use a case study. I have four kids, two boys, two girls, ages 6 to teenager. We watch The Lord of the Rings every year in my house. Every Christmas break between Christmas and New Year's, the last week of the year, we watch the extended edition of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Ring films. And my teenage daughter gets something out of it. My preteen son gets something out of it. My younger son gets something out of it. And my 6 year old gets something out of it. Now, before you get angry letters about how terrible of a parent I am for showing Lord of the Rings to a 6 year old, we do have moments where they close their eyes. They're very well trained to close their eyes when dad says to close their eyes. There are some pretty intense moments for them, but every one of them gets something out of it. My wife is not a Lord of the Rings aficionado, I would say. She's not necessarily a story based person, but even she watches Lord of the Rings and she gets things out of it as well. So in just the microcosm of my little family, maybe I have biased the sample set here, but I see that everybody in my little circle of my family, they resonate and they get something different out of Lord of the Rings.
What do you think J.R.R. Tolkien would make of all of the adaptations of his work and like where the franchise exists today?
Yeah, um, that's a good question. I think on the one hand, he'd be completely surprised at how far it's gone. I think he knew that he had something amazing, but I think he didn't quite understand. I think he was so humble in his own opinion of himself and his ability as a writer that I think he would be shocked at how much his stories have gone and how far that they've gone. On the one hand, on another hand, he was very much opposed to uh, uh, film adaptations of his work, like,
Hmm.
and not opposed to it per se. Like he didn't like the concept, but any film treatment that was pitched to him, any screenplay that he read, he was just like, "This is trash. This is garbage. You've cut out key points of the story." Da da da. Like he was very critical of those things. Now, at the same time, I know you want to react to that, but at the same time, you just saw me. I pulled a book off of my shelf. It's my copy of the Silmarillion, and there's a letter printed in here that Tolkien once wrote to a publisher when he was trying to get somebody to publish the Silmarillion. And he said something like this. He said this quote: "I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama." So Tolkien said, yeah, I will paint this huge thing. It needs to have a rhyme in and of itself, but I will leave places for others to explore. But here's the last word of what he said right after that. He said, absurd. So you can see in just this little quote here, Tolkien has this idea of, I want to create this huge mythology that other people can participate in the creation of it. They can take, maybe I leave a story unexplored, maybe I just mention it, and somebody else in drama or in paint could take that story further. But then he finishes this quote up by saying, absurd, as in, I have this grand vision, but nobody would ever do that. Like, like like how prideful it is of me, Tolkien, to think that other people would want to fill in the holes that I leave behind with my grand legendarium. And so you get these mixed signals from Tolkien. What would he make of his stories today? On the one hand, I think he would be absolutely shocked. On another hand, I think he would be absolutely thrilled. And on still another hand, I think he would be extremely critical of any on-screen adaptation that we have seen to date, just because he was so critical of anything that was attempted during his lifetime.
I mean, do you think he would have liked the trilogy, like Lord of the Rings? I mean, I can only imagine what he would have thought of The Hobbit and everything else. But look, I mean, it's often argued, and I think it's fair that the Lord of the Rings film trilogy is pretty spot on. Yeah, there's artistic
Yeah.
changes. Yeah, there's a lot left out, but it does a very good job of giving you the crux of the story, the bare bones, and
Mm-hmm.
it uses some good kind of, how to put it, good cinematography and stuff like that, and tricks and everything from the film industry, where they're able to kind of build the story and not completely destroy what the books had to offer. You
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm. I think as films,
Mm.
independent of the written story, Tolkien would probably say that they're masterpieces, because I think there's hardly anybody, there's a small contingent of people who would say that the films are not masterpieces in and of themselves. From every scene, every shot, every line of dialogue, from the music to the visuals to the story, like they really are just masterpieces. They're amazing. When it comes to the adaptation of his story to the film, I think he would be pleased for the most part, but I still think he would have some highly critical things to say. I don't know if he would, he said, well, you left out like the Prince of Dol Amroth in Gondor, and you combined characters into Éomer, like they were all important to the story. Like, okay, you skipped Tom Bombadil, and he actually wrote in one of his letters, he's like, okay, I could see how you would skip Tom Bombadil in the films. If you've only seen the films and you haven't read the books, then you have no idea who I'm talking about. But Tom Bombadil is this really mysterious type character who Frodo meets, and he's
Mm.
not in the films at all, not even referenced. And so I think Tolkien would be like, okay, I could see how you would trim that out, but he was very much in favor of, you can trim things out, but don't change the story, which is really hard to do when you're going from book to film. And that's kind of his main criticism of some of the treatments that he saw during his lifetime was, you completely changed my story. And I haven't read those treatments. I don't know how far off they were from adaptation, but I think as a whole, he would likely be pleased, but still have some very critical notes for Peter Jackson and Philippa Boyens and Fran Walsh.
What do you make of the Lord of the Rings fandom? Because I must say, in this day and age, like I hear all sorts about like the Star Wars fandom, the Harry
Yeah,
Potter fandom, etc.
yeah.
I never really hear anyone talk about the Lord of the Rings fandom. I never hear anything negative.
Hmm.
I understand people are passionate about it and fiercely love the books and stuff like that.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
This is a really good question, and this is one of the things. And I am obviously biased here, and I'm very well aware of that bias. But I think the Lord of the Rings fandom is different and unique from other fandoms that are out there for a few reasons. And one is, like I mentioned before, the Lord of the Rings fandom, the roots of it, the foundation of it, it's very much literature based, right? Which is already a little bit different. So when you approach Star Wars or Star Trek, like you're coming from this movie on screen visual storytelling medium, and then you get books and things that go deeper, and that's fine. But Lord of the Rings is the inverse of that. And you might say, well, yeah, well, Harry Potter is as well. But I think Harry Potter is still also a function of modern storytelling. And I think what Lord of the Rings did was not only was it book to screen, but it was a book that essentially was a redefining of an ancient mode of storytelling, and it cast a new mold for storytelling that current modern storytellers are still following that mold and some of those patterns. And I think Lord of the Rings really sets that apart. And I think the fans see that and they expect that. Lord of the Rings also is different from some of these other universes because it has such layers of complexity and depth to it. You know, you read Game of Thrones or you look at Game of Thrones, and honestly, I'm not huge into Game of Thrones universe, but it's very much political intrigue and humans being humans to each other in the worst case, and there's almost like very few like actual noble things about it. Lord of the Rings is much different. It was intended to be, as Tolkien once said, high and purged of the gross, and you know, not gross in terms of maybe what we would call gross, but just lesser things, but more ennobling, more inspiring, more uplifting, and trying to set our heights higher. And I think that resonates a lot with the fan base of, you know, somebody once told me the Lord of the Rings is too wholesome. It needs to be less wholesome. And I was like, no, that's kind of the point. Is the point is to like turn away from things that are not wholesome or whatever, and point your sights, your attention to something a little bit higher than what Tolkien called quote unquote the gross things of life. Um, so that there's a few things for that, and I think another key differentiator between these fandoms is Tolkien's been dead for 50 years, right? He's not on social media. He can't say things that half of his fans might be offended by. Uh, we're not going to get any new stories out of Tolkien. We're not going to get any new languages. We're not going to get any new characters. And so, what you have from Tolkien, it's what you have. And the amazing thing about it is, you go back and you look at various different manuscripts and different versions of the stories, and you have this thought exercise of, oh, well, what if the story had played out differently this way? What if we had followed this version of the manuscript versus the one that was published? And you get these thought exercises whereas when you watch Star Wars or something like that, you just don't get that. You know, George Lucas could create more Star Wars. J.K. Rowling could write more Harry Potter. Uh, G George R.R. Martin could write more Games of Thrones, and he is, right. And you have this like back and forth dance between audience, fans, and the creator. And I think Tolkien just doesn't have that. And we as Tolkien fans have accepted that, and we're okay with that. Um, I know the Star Wars fandom has become very toxic. You have a
Yeah.
lot of people who hate what Disney has done with Star Wars. I love Star Wars. I think it's great. I think it's entertaining. I'm not. I could go on a Star Wars podcast and hold my own. Probably not as much as I could Lord of the Rings for sure. But with the Rings of Power adaptations, I've once wrote an open letter to the Lord of the Rings fan base saying, "Look, Lord of the Rings fans, we cannot descend to what Star Wars has become as fans, where your token of being a fan is that you love Star Wars so much that you hate anything that's new or anything that doesn't line up with what you think is Star Wars." And like, no, we have to continue to love Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, and we'll take adaptations as they come, and we'll treat them on their own merits, and they're not above criticism. Like, I just criticize Tolkien. I don't think Tolkien's above criticism, but we need to accept it in a place of love and criticism that is fair, but we will never hate an adaptation just because hating something that we're supposed to love is now the epitome of loving the thing that you're supposed to love. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where you talk about the Lord of the Rings fandom. That's where I'm coming from.
No, I get what you're saying. I think it's something that has to be cherished and not destroyed. And I never understood all of that. Like, look, I'm not a fan of the sequels, but I don't like attack the people that made it. I mean, it's like, look,
Hmm.
some things just don't land with people. Whatever you do, people are going to like it, people are going to dislike it, you know. But sometimes you have a situation where more people like something or dislike something than the other, you know, group of people. I think the only time it's ever really like something that needs to be where people have to like, you know, like call something out, if you like, is when something is changed in a way that like detracts from
Hmm.
what it's meant to be in some way, shape, or form. I mean, and
Yeah.
this kind of leads me on to my next question. With like future adaptations and stuff like that, there's a few things I want to ask you. So, one cool thing that Marvel did, which I think should be used as a series idea for like all fandoms, like I think it would be amazing, is the What If series that they did. I
Mm.
thought it was just fascinating. Like, okay, but what if it had played out like this? I'm flabbergasted that Star Wars hasn't done it yet. I'm sorry, but like, what if Anakin killed Obi-Wan on Mustafar? Like, come on,
Yeah.
this. I mean, they kind of did it in like games and stuff, but like, imagine that. And oh
Yeah.
my God, Lord of the Rings. Imagine if, you know, Sauron got the ring, you know, or there's so many
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah. There's a lot of what if scenarios you could explore there for sure.
Sure. So I guess like I got a couple of questions. Like one question would be like, do you think that would be a cool idea, a good idea for Lord of the Rings? Secondly, like how do you feel about because obviously to do something like that, you'd have to bring in people who writers who would take the source material and then obviously make artistic differences changes and write their own story. So they wouldn't be Tolkien; they would be someone else writing Lord of the Rings, which is almost sacrilege to say that, but like you know that's how you get these stories from a author who's no longer with us. Can you speak to that? Do you think it's something that like his estate would allow? Is that in the realm of possibility? Is it a good idea? And all of the above.
Yeah, that's an intriguing idea. I think there'd be lots of material if you wanted to kind of look at what if,
Mm.
what if this, that, and the other. Uh, and in some ways, Tolkien actually explained a lot of this in some of his letters. He said, okay, well, what if Frodo did claim the ring and Gollum wasn't there to fall into the lava? What would have happened in that situation? So Tolkien actually did explore some of these what if scenarios in his letters, which, hey, that'd be great if Tolkien explored that a little bit and let's he gave us the bones of a story. Let's go deeper on that. That'd be
Now
fantastic.
that's a good idea because
Yeah,
that's coming directly from something he's written.
right. And you can find that in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's a published book, and he explored some of those. And there's not many. There's probably less than half a dozen. But even you just take those few scenarios that he did consider and do a little mini series on that. That would be really really cool. Does it work for the Lord of the Rings story? I don't know if it does. When it comes to Marvel, you have all these decades of comic books, and you have different versions of Spider-Man and different versions of Batman. And there's a couple of beats. Batman has to be Batman. He has to be an orphan, or else he's not Batman. And so it's like you have a couple of like beats, but you also have a lot of leeway that you could play with those different characters, and that has sort of been the nature of a comic book story from the beginning. Lord of the Rings is not does not lend itself, I think, to that storytelling structure so much so because a major theme of Lord of the Rings is the theme of chance. Or in other words, things are so unlikely to work out for the good peoples of Middle Earth. Like the odds are stacked against them, like 99 to 1. And so you need these really small, tiny chances, uh, that everything just has to line up perfectly to make the Lord of the Rings, to make the good people win in the Lord of the Rings. And that's actually like a really major theme. I'll give you one example. When Frodo finally does leave Bag End, he's listening to Sam's dad, the gaffer, talking with someone down the road. Now he can't see because they're kind of around a corner, but he can hear. And then he's like, "Oh, that's a weird conversation." He hops over the hedge and then he leaves, and he leaves Bag End. What you find out later is Sam's dad is talking with one of the Nazgul as a Black Rider. So it's like you have a servant of Sauron literally around the corner from the One Ring, trying to find the One Ring, and it's only Sam's dad who believes that Frodo is already gone. He's like, "Oh yeah, they left this morning. They're already gone." Only because Sam's dad misunderstood what was happening does the Black Rider turn around and leave, right? So it's like one little difference of Sam's dad saying, "Oh yeah, Frodo's still there." Well, Black Rider just rides up and boom, Frodo's sitting on the road outside of Bag End, kills Frodo, ring back, done, right? We're all over, right? And so that's like that's like one of dozens and dozens and dozens of close calls and little chances and tiny little meetings that if it had not had happened, the whole story would have been different. So the Lord of the Rings in and of itself is already primed for like everything's going to fail, and if anything changes, then everything fails. So I don't know if you could go to a what if scenario and be like, okay, but it still works out in the end. The ring still gets destroyed and good people's Middle Earth. And it's like, if you don't want to have that ending, okay, great. That's a great what if scenario. But if you're still trying to find, and it's been a while since I looked at those what if Marvel stories, but I'm like, I think kind of the general premise is, okay, it could have happened differently in the middle, but it started and ended somewhat the same, but some little things happened differently. And so I don't know if that lends itself so much so to Lord of the Rings just because of the theme of chance and how many close calls there are.
I gotta say though that what you laid out, like the what if scenarios from his letters, I think that's a no brainer. They should really explore
Mm.
that, even if it is just
Hmm.
a dozen stories. I mean, it's a continuation of his work, is it not? It's
Yeah.
I think also I want to see more animation anime. I think that's a great way to do it. That was
Hmm.
really well done in the What If series, and it worked. You forget about it after like 5 minutes. You just like it's just a story at that point,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know. I just feel like people are clamoring to see more Lord of the Rings on the screen, because. But here's the thing, and maybe this can be like a final note. We're never going to be able to recreate the magic of the Lord of the Rings trilogy films, just in the same way as even if there are future stories in the future, you're never going to get a book series like Lord of the Rings again.
Hmm.
And maybe that's the beauty of it, like because that teaches you a life lesson. It's
Yeah.
it exists in its time, and it's there for future generations to enjoy for the future for many years to come. People are always going to come and go and create stories out of what has already been, but nothing will ever compare quite with like the original, what it was.
Yeah.
It just is, and that's kind of the beauty of it. It will never die. It'll always be Lord of the Rings.
Hmm. Yeah. I love that you say that. It is unique. It is a league of its own for generations to come. And I am inspired. I ask this question to my audience, to people on social media, to people in real life all the time. How were you first introduced to Tolkien? And the stories that people share of how they first came to Middle Earth, to Lord of the Rings, to Tolkien, it's so amazing. And there's a major theme, which is I had a family member who loved it, who knew me, who saw me, who heard me, and said, "Hey, you might like this thing." And they gave me a book, and I read it, and I was hooked. Like, it came from a dad, from an uncle, from a mom, from a teacher, from a school librarian, right? And this generation of people, they are passing this down from one generation to another, and I think it's just a unique and beautiful thing that way.
Thank you so much for sharing and for appearing on the show once more. It's been magical, man. I've really enjoyed talking Lord of the Rings and Tolkien with you. yeah, final question. Do you have any upcoming projects, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on a two-part episode. For anybody who's still listening right now, like you are in the deep end. This is amazing. You get gold star for you. This that's really amazing. And you know, Christian, we could continue to talk Lord of the Rings forever, right? And some
Mm.
people do, and academics have, and fans have for a long, long time. But for me, it is one of the most beautiful stories ever told, and it is told in I think the absolute most beautiful way that a story could be told. And I just find more depth and truth and wisdom in it every time I engage with it, and I love it. So if any of your listeners want to go further than this two-part conversation of Lord of the Rings, then come find me at ringspodcast.com, and you can come wander Middle Earth with me, and we'll get lost wandering the world and works of J.R.R. Tolkien.
It's been an absolute pleasure, man. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I wish you the best of luck with the show. Keep it going, man. Keep the stories alive. To all the listeners of the Christian Reeve podcast, thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I hope you've enjoyed this two-parter, and yeah, on to the next stories, right? Thank you so much, and I'll
Thank
see you
you.
in the next one.